I'm so excited to be starting my book tour here with so many friends and colleagues in the audience. It's really just been this is just a wonderful experience for me. Thank you so much for coming out. I just learned that this is kind of a tough night for you to be out. I can't imagine the cost, the psychic cost, but I consider you the hardcore, my true fans and followers. So I'm going to try to really make it worth your while and hit a home run. And I'm very excited and very grateful. So look, to put it most simply, I'm going to be talking about a crisis in empathy. And I'm going to suggest that we can cure this crisis in empathy with conversation. That what we need to do is reclaim conversation. Well, what happened to conversation? Aren't we talking all the time? Because I'm saying no, not exactly. These days we readily admit that in business and in love and our families and friendships, we'd really often text rather than talk. We'd rather email than be face to face. Now, why is that? What is it that our phones and our email offer us that's so seductive? Well, sometimes I like to say that what our phones offer us are 4 gifts, as though gifts from a benevolent genie. Maybe 5 gifts, lots of gifts from a benevolent genie. What are they? First of all, that we will always be heard, always, whenever you want. Second, we can put our attention wherever we want it to be. You never have to be alone. You never have to be bored. And because you can edit, and even sometimes you can get your friends, like an army of Cyranos, to help you with your texts, you can always get it right. You can have the fantasy of always getting it right. You can present yourself as you want to be seen. And this last one, more and more as I worked on reclaiming conversation, this last one, particularly for young people, became key for me. Because from childhood on, these days, our culture is preoccupied with presentation, with getting it right. And of course, here you can have the fantasy of getting things right if you present yourself in a medium like texting or email or messaging, where you can edit yourself, or even where you can present, as on Facebook, only the things about your life that you want to be seen. That's why there's this famous fear of missing out, because everybody is only presenting the highlights. Like today I did a certain number of events, but I would only post the really good ones. I would only post the parts of today that I considered my best. So anybody looking at my day today on Facebook wouldn't see my little disappointments, they would only see my triumphs. And it all adds up to a kind of cultivation of a notion of self-protection, a flight from vulnerability, a flight from showing ourselves as we really are. It all adds up to a flight from conversation, the kind of conversation where we make ourselves vulnerable, or even as I'm doing now, where you can kind of see me hesitate, stop, think on my feet, get something wrong, have to backtrack. I'm not just talking about kind of conversation, 2 people, kind of struggling back and forth, but a professor in a lecture, anything where you're sort of seeing it live. I'm talking about conversation that's open-ended, that has a certain spontaneity, conversation in which we play with ideas, in which we allow ourselves to be fully present. Conversations in which we allow ourselves, again, most important, to be vulnerable. Yet those are the kinds of conversations, those conversations in which we allow ourselves to be fully present and vulnerable, those are the conversations in which intimacy and empathy flourish. But what's happening now? We're distracted at our dinner tables, in our living rooms, at our business meetings, in my case, at our faculty meetings, where everybody is kind of texting under the table and doing their email on their tablets, under their papers, pretending that they're paying attention. We're distracted in our classrooms where students are texting instead of paying attention, in our boardrooms where it's commonplace for people to be texting during the meetings. we're finding traces of what I would call a new silent spring. So silent spring is the term that Rachel Carson coined when she wanted to describe a moment when we were ready to see an assault on our environment. And now I'm saying we've arrived at another moment of recognition, another moment where I think we're ready to see something that we haven't wanted to see. But this time, technology is implicated in an assault on empathy, because research shows that even a silent phone between two people at a lunch table causes them to share less with each other. So here's the experiment. You sit two people down, and of course there's a control group, so everything is done, versus another group. You sit two people down, you put a phone between them, a silent phone, one that's obviously turned off, and the two people will not only have a conversation that is more trivial and less on things kind of any consequence, but they will also feel less empathic connection with each other, less sense of the consequence of their relationship. And if you redo the experiment, this time in a natural setting, not in a laboratory, and you put the phone not between them on a table, but really in the periphery of their vision, so they can only see it like that, you get the same results. More trivial conversation in terms of content, and less empathic connection with each other, less invested in each other. So it's not surprising that in the past 20 years, we've seen a 40% decline in levels of empathy among college students, with most of the decline taking place in the past 10 years, which is something that most researchers, of course, link to the presence of digital devices. And I just want to say parenthetically, because I want this to be something that perhaps we can talk about in the question and answer period, that the researcher, the brilliant researcher who headed that study, was so upset. I mean, she was obviously very upset with this finding. I mean, it was a stunning finding, this tremendous meta-analysis of the 20 years of data. And the thing she took up after doing that study was to try to invent, or to turn her attention to invent, empathy apps for the iPhone. So the question is whether we, of which there are many, both for adults and for children. There's a crisis in empathy. I'm arguing that, among other things, we need to look to our use of devices for how we got there. Are we going to look to devices to help us get out of there? What is the role of technology in helping us face this? In my business, this is a very, very hot question. And it should be a hot question for all of us, because I should say that only 3 weeks ago, I was interviewed for an article on Hello Barbie. You may have seen this article in the New York Times, which is a doll that's supposed to increase empathic capacity by coming out of the box and by saying, "Hi, I'm Barbie. I love you. I have a sister, and I hate her. I'm jealous of her. Do you have a sister? I heard you have a sister, can program it in advance. Do you hate your sister? Let's talk." In other words, creating artificial intelligence that pretends empathy, gets you into an as-if relationship, an as-if conversation. And I would argue, and I hope this is something that we can take up together, cannot teach empathy because it does not know the arc of a human life. And pretend and as-if conversations is not going to get us where we need to go. And it's reclaiming conversation with each other that's a much better bet. Because there's good news in all of this 40%, 40 years, 20 years, 40% decline, this sort of dark picture. There's some very good news. We are resilient. We are essentially wired for empathy. We are wired for conversation. In one study, in only 5 days at a summer camp, where you can't bring any devices, kind of device-free summer camp, children begin to relearn the capacity to identify with the feelings of others. And how do they do that? They talk to each other. Face-to-face conversation is the most human and humanizing thing that we know how to do. So I'm not here to talk about how we should be giving up our phones. I am not anti-technology. I am pro-conversation. If you use your phone to bring you into more communication and contact and loving, I'm always the one whose phone goes off. It is always somebody over a certain age whose phone rings. Young people know to turn off their phones. I have a 24-year-old daughter who works at LinkedIn. This is God sending a message to me. She always reminds me that it's never a 24-year-old whose phone goes off. I'm not here to talk about how we should be giving up our phones. It's about using them mindfully, and with intention. And when we do, conversation is there to reclaim. For the failing connections of our digital world, it is the talking cure. And to reclaim it, we don't have to invent anything, because we have what we need. We have each other. So I'm going to make a case for conversation, and I'm going to begin that case by saying a very few words, about a person who most people never think of in the context of conversation, because they think of him as a kind of hermit, wrongly, who would not have to do with conversation at all, somebody who tried to get with it all, away from it all, and this is Henry David Thoreau. And actually, Thoreau loved solitude, but he also loved talk. And some people, in fact, joked that Thoreau could hear Mrs. Emerson's dinner bell from his cabin in Walden Pond, and he understood the profound relationship between solitude and conversation. And that's why I like Thoreau very much, because in reclaiming conversation, I try again and again to make the link between reclaiming solitude and reclaiming conversation. That we're missing both things in our culture today, a capacity for solitude and the capacity for conversation, and that these two things go together. And Thoreau really understood this connection, and he writes about it very movingly. In Walden, Thoreau wrote that in his cabin, he had 3 chairs. He had 1 chair for solitude, he had 2 chairs for friendship, and he had 3 chairs for society. And that image, 1 chair for solitude, 2 chairs for friendship, and 3 chairs for society, grounded me as I wrote Reclaiming Conversation, and inspired me because it captures what we know to be a virtuous circle when it comes to the matter of conversation. Now, what is that virtuous circle? A virtuous circle is when everything works together, every part is enhanced and works better. So as a psychologist, here's how this virtuous circle works: solitude, friendship, society, and the matter of conversation. In solitude, you find yourself, you prepare yourself to conversation with something to say that's authentic, that's yours. And then, in conversation with other people, both in private and in the public sphere, we learn to have conversations with ourselves, the self-reflection that is the cornerstone for development and that continues throughout life. As I've been studying conversation in digital culture, I've found a disruption in this virtuous circle, and the disruption begins with Thoreau's first chair, the chair of solitude. Recent research shows, and perhaps some of you have heard of this study, but to pun terribly, it's stunning and shocking. Recent research shows that people are uncomfortable if left alone with their own thoughts for only 6 minutes. So here's the study. It was a series of studies, actually, of 21 studies at the University of Virginia, but the one I'm going to talk about involved college students who were told that they were going to be asked to sit alone for 6 to 15 minutes without a device or a book. And they were asked at the beginning of the study, so could you imagine that if in this time you might want to administer an electroshock to yourself? And they said, well, here's like the electroshock, you know, just try it out. And people said, no. No one said that that was something that they would even consider. And they said, well, what about if we like paid you? I mean, it was like completely not going to happen. After 6 minutes, the students were shocking themselves. Rather than spend any more time in quiet reflection. So the experimental results, as I said, to make a terrible pun, are stunning, but they're not surprising. Why are they not surprising? I spend a lot of time in my field work when I was studying the incapacity for solitude, just like at checkout lines in a supermarket, at stop signs in Cambridge. Go to a stop sign and watch behavior at a stop sign. People cannot go to a stop sign without pulling out a phone. It's crazy. The solitude of a stop sign has become intolerable. And this is where the virtuous circle breaks. We struggle to pay attention to ourselves. And what suffers is our ability to pay attention to each other. We struggle to pay attention to ourselves, and what suffers is our ability to pay attention to each other. There's a word in the dictionary now. How many people have heard of a word called phubbing? Nobody. One. Phubbing means staring somebody in the face, making eye contact while I text out of your line of sight. And my students tell me they all learned it in middle school when they were texting under the table in middle school. That they do it all the time and it's not that hard. So what's going on? What's going on? We want to be with each other, but we also want to be in this elsewhere that I described in the beginning, connected to wherever we want to be, because in a way, the thing that we've come to value most is control over where we put our attention. And I see a fascinating example of this when I interview college students who talk about what they call the rule of 3 that they follow for conversation in their dining halls. So basically, here's the rule of 3. It begins with the baseline that you want to have your phone and be on your phone, have access to your phone during dinner. But you also want to go to dinner with your friends. So how are you going to do this? 3 faces have to be up in the conversation before you give yourself permission to put your face down and text or go on social media or do your social media feed. So what's the result of that? It means that conversation proceeds, but again, just like that conversation with the phone on the table between the 2 people, it becomes less about anything because it needs to be about something where it can be interrupted. It's not going to be about anything significant. And it has to be about something where people can flip in and out of the conversation at any point. So the effect of the rule of 3 is really what you'd expect. Conversation is kept light on topics where people can move in and out, and you don't really make much of a connection. And again, this is that empathy part. You feel part of the group. You're in a social group, but you're not really closely following anybody's story. Now, I interviewed hundreds of young people for reclaiming conversation, and many of the young people I interviewed say that they feel something is amiss, and they feel that it's time to put something right. That's why Reclaiming Conversation is fundamentally an optimistic book, because it's a story of people who are doing something where they feel something is amiss and they want to put it right. 89% of Americans say that in their last social encounter they pulled out a phone when they were with people. And 82% of them say it deteriorated the conversation they were in. So we're doing something that we're not comfortable with. It's not that we're sort of like, it's all cool. I began my research thinking that I'd be studying the new conversations on texting and social media. But the young people I interviewed told me to follow a different story. Here's one college junior telling me what to study. He said, don't study just texting. Our texting is fine. This is his quote. Our texting is fine. It's what our texting is doing to our conversations in person. That's the problem. I think that's such an amazing comment. Don't study just our texting, he said. Our texting is fine. It's what our texting is doing to our conversations in person. That's the problem. And it was a powerful insight. Remember that research that shows that even the presence of the phone on the table changes what people talk about and the degree of connection they feel toward each other. The research that shows that even a silent phone disconnects us. So what's going on? Why this flight from conversation, this preference to go to our phones, this new litany of people saying I'd rather text than talk? One young man in an interview, and this was an 18-year-old, gave me what I think of as the iconic answer. And he said, conversation? I'll tell you what's wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time, and you can't control what you're going to say. If we text rather than talk, we can have each other at a distance in amounts we can control. Texting and email and posting, as I said, lets us present the self we want to be. We can edit, retouch. I've called it the Goldilocks effect. We can't get enough of each other if we can have each other at a digital distance, not too close, not too far, just right. But human relationships are just not like that. They're rich and they're messy, they're demanding, and when we clean them up with technology, what I fear is that we move from conversation to mere connection. And what I fear is that when this happens, we start to forget the difference. And I see this in my field work when people who are talking take out their phones during any kind of quiet time in the conversation. They start to call it a lull, as though a lull in the conversation means that they can go like this. That's a lull. They check their messages, they go onto social media, they check their Instagram accounts. They tell me that they get anxious. One woman says, I'm impatient during the boring bits. The boring bits. We become accustomed to thinking of life as a kind of steady feed, like the crawl, underneath the news. We turn a lull and we turn a moment alone into problems that we want to be solved. And people try to solve them by technology. Just think of that researcher who found a gap in empathy and thought that there's an app for that. Is there an app for that? And we slip into thinking that always being connected is going to make us less lonely. But again, I'm worried. I think we're at risk because I think it's the reverse. If we're unable to be alone, we'll be more lonely. And here I sum up a long tradition of psychodynamic thinking on the subject. If we cannot teach our children to be alone, they will only know how to be lonely. The capacity for solitude is closely linked to the capacity for relationship. If you take one thing away from what I'm saying this evening, the one thing I feel most passionately about, the capacity to be alone is linked to the capacity for relationship. You begin to reclaim conversation by reclaiming solitude. You begin to reclaim solitude by reclaiming conversation. So I'm not suggesting that we run away from our devices, just that we have a more self-aware relationship with them. And as I say, I'm optimistic because we are resilient. Remember that study that shows that only a few days without screens and children begin to recover empathic capacity. In fact, I spent a lot of time at a device-free camp, and I've heard what that resiliency sounds like. Campers recover a taste for solitude, and at the same time they recover a taste for connection. Taste for solitude, taste for connection. So here's how they sound. One 14-year-old boy reflects on his new taste for silence. Here's what this sounds like. Quote, "Don't people know that sometimes you can just look out of the window of a car and see the world go by, and it's wonderful?" And here's how they talked about connection. Campers said they were more interested in their summer friends than their friends at school. And I asked why. I mean, are the summer friends going to spend more time with them? Or, they're different kind of guys and girls? And they said no. They just thought that the difference was that at home, they talk with their friends about what's on their phones. And at camp, they talk to each other about their feelings, that it was as simple as that. So I've been talking about the conversations of Thoreau's first and second chair, conversations of solitude and self-reflection, of friendship and family. Well, what of Thoreau's third chair? The conversations of society, of business, of politics. It's very important to say something about them because I've done so much work on children, babies, toddlers, teenagers, that sometimes people will think that this is kind of a children's story, and it's very important to make the very simple point that the issues about conversation, the troubles we're having with conversation, are not just kid stuff. They come up, for example, in business settings. Studies now make it clear that conversation at work is good for the bottom line. When employees take their breaks together, productivity goes up. You can measure conversation with what one very brilliant researcher, Ben Weber, calls sociometric badges. Badges you get people to wear that actually measure conversation, in fact, measure tone and inflection. And you can see that talking together increases productivity. And yet so many people think that they are only being productive when they're sitting at their screens answering their mail. What are they really feeling? They're feeling in control of this enormous amount of material that's coming in that makes them anxious. They're feeling in control, but they're wrong about their productivity. They're actually wrong about their productivity. And I was presenting some of this research about the relationship of conversation and productivity at a conference, at a business conference. And after my talk, I was seated at dinner between two business owners. And the first said that in his business, I was absolutely right. You needed face-to-face conversation to close a deal. And he sells support services to engineers. And he says when people make inquiries to his business, they'll get in touch with an email and they'll ask for a return email. But his company has studied their business, and he knows that they'll get more inquiries and they'll get actually turning into accounts if they don't send a return email the way they're being asked to, but actually call back, or even better, call back and then insist on a visit. Now, why is that? Because when an engineer buys their services, what is the engineer buying? The engineer is buying a guarantee that when something goes wrong with their technology, and something is always going to go wrong with technology, somebody has their back. They're buying a relationship, and nobody buys a relationship over an email. But despite that, it is very hard for him to get people to talk to him. They want to do business, emails all the way. As he was telling the story, he's on my left, he's on my right, the guy seated to my left, who runs a large consulting practice in healthcare, said he could relate to that story totally, but he had another curlicue on it because he said he couldn't rely on the young people he was hiring to make those calls. He said his young recruits don't want to talk on the phone. Staff members at his firm are told to check when new hires say they have, quote, talked to clients. Have they spoken with clients with their voice? Have they voicing talking? Because out of college and graduate school, new recruits will use the word talk to refer to an email exchange, and very few will use the phone except when explicitly instructed to do so. And I'm talking to a vice president of a consulting firm, and she's explaining to me that when she's hiring a new recruit, this is her tactic. She says there'll be a very fancy business school student, and they'll come in, and they're ready for like one conversation. And they're prepped, and they'll have this one great conversation. And then at the end of the conversation, she says, that was wonderful. But she's just kind of like phoning it in for this conversation. She says, because they're like on automatic pilot. They've like, their counselor has told them how to do this one conversation. She says, this was wonderful. I want you to go home now. I want you to think about our conversation. I want you to come back tomorrow with what you got out of this conversation and some notes about where 2 other conversations on the themes that we've discussed should really go so we can get to know each other better. And she says, they are like deers caught in the headlights. They thought they were going to have one conversation and like some follow-up emails. And that's how she hires. So when we look at Thoreau and his third chair conversations, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to business. And let me just turn now very briefly to another kind of third chair conversation, the conversations of the public square, really where we are right now, in a public meeting, in public discourse. So we've long known how important public conversations are to democracy. There have been markets and town squares, town meetings, there have been clubs and coffee houses and salons. And what they had in common was that they were places to talk about politics, and more than that, to learn how to talk about politics. In the 17th century, Joseph Addison, the essayist and politician, made the point that he enjoys coffee house debates because they're a place to learn. And he says to that effect, to that end, that in the coffee house, he has, quote, taken a particular care never to be of the same opinion with the man I conversed with. It's worth pausing on that, not just because he says with the man, because that was his time. When Addison went to the coffee house, he only wanted to talk to people he disagreed with. And a recent Pew study, Pew again is the firm that studies our digital behavior, a recent Pew study showed when people go online, they don't want to share opinions that they don't think their followers will approve of. It's called the spiral of silence. And another study shows that today's students, just so we don't blame everything on the internet, today's students avoid talking about politics face to face with people who they don't think agree with them, even if those other students live down the hall. No, just thinking. Okay. She's supposed to give me a 5-minute sign, like she's my Oscar music, so she has to be very careful of like where she moves her hands. Right? Okay. Like the. So even if the other student lives right down the hall, they don't want to talk to those students if those students are in agreement. But even if we are a long way from Addison, and we are the longest way from Addison in all of this, to me, his image of what conversation is about inspires. It's a touchstone. And here is why. He is using a public conversation to keep him open to changing his mind. And that's why we come to meetings such as this, to have public conversations, to learn from each other, to try to change our minds. I don't expect everybody here to agree with me. I want to change your mind. And that's why we're here. So what can we do in all of this? What are some first steps? Because we're not looking for solutions here. This is not the problems that I've sketched out: empathy, public conversation, friendship, solitude. I mean, this is not about, here are 4 solutions. We're talking about beginnings. And even if these beginnings seem like, oh, well, these seem like little things, when you take them together, they start to be culturally a lot. So here are some beginnings that I see as first steps. First of all, and here's the thing you're doing tonight: participate however you can in a revitalization of public conversation. Public conversation gives us a way to reclaim private conversation because they can model how private conversation can unfold. They can model tolerance. They can model genuine interest in what other people are saying. They can teach how conversation can be most fruitful, not in proclamations or broadcasts or bullet points, but in negotiation, turn-taking, and other rhythms of true respect. Second, and here I've made this point a couple of times, and this is my rule of 3. This is the 3rd time that I'm mentioning it. Remember that the presence of a device already signals that your attention is divided, even if you don't intend it to be. It will limit your conversation in 2 ways: how you listen and what you'll be talking about, and actually a 3rd way, the degree of connection that you'll feel with the person you're with and they'll feel with you. These are striking research results that I did not anticipate when I began this project. This is important. It will change what you'll talk about, and it will change how you'll listen, and it will change the degree of connection that you will feel with the person you are with. You do not want that happening in your family. You do not want that happening with your loved one, with your friends, with your colleagues, with your workers, with your teachers. This is not a good idea. It doesn't mean you have to give up your phone. It just means your phone has to be put in its place. So create sacred spaces at home, at work. Start with the kitchen, the dining room, the car. Significant meetings, no devices. Third, accept what research has made clear. We become less effective with every new task we multitask. Unitasking is the next big thing. You heard it here. There is no such thing as multitasking. The brain does not know this. The brain did not have Windows. You do one thing at a time, and multitasking plays a trick on us that is an amazing trick, because every time you add a new task, you think you are doing better at every task, and in fact, you are doing worse and worse at every task. So people become like crazy people because they think they are doing better and better, they want to add more and more, and in fact, they're doing worse and worse. So be good to yourself, be good to your children, be good to your students. Make multitasking a practice. Unitasking is the key to productivity and creativity. I love it when Zadie Smith, in the beginning of her most recent novel, thanks Freedom, which is the program that blocks Wi-Fi on the Mac, for letting her finish her novel. Because all of us have a version of that story. Next, cultivate solitude. Cultivate the capacity to be alone with your thoughts. Some of the most crucial conversations you're going to have are conversations with yourself. To have them, you have to be able to listen to your own voice. Again, set aside your laptops and tablets and put away your phone. Next, slow down. Tutored by technology, we become reactive, we become transactional. Emails and texts make us feel that we should answer and right away. Protect your creativity, go slowly, find your own agenda. Give yourself permission, and this is one of my favorite pieces of advice, because you will see that if you follow this advice, it will go viral. Give yourself permission to respond to emails by saying, I'm thinking. Nobody does that. I'm thinking about that. It's very powerful. Don't try for perfection. My students will come to office hours, and I ask them what they want to email me, and they want me to email them back. And I ask them why. And they say, because in an email, I can get it perfect. I can get my idea perfect to you, you'll get my perfect idea, and then you will give me the most value back by sending me the perfect-ish answer back. And I'm thinking, first of all, me, 10 o'clock at night, 11, 12, sending them the perfect email back. I mean, who can stand this pressure? But then also, it's the model of how relationship, how learning, how happens. Because anyone who loves learning, anyone who loves knowledge, anyone who's a teacher knows that I am here before you tonight, not because somebody sent me a perfect email in answer to my perfect question, but because somebody in my background sat down with me, had a conversation with me, said, you're worth it, you're smart, or that's wrong, but we can make it better, or this paper's no good, but I'm sticking with you and we're going to make it better. This idea of a transactional information processing thing in which everybody's going to be perfect, and that is the path to knowledge, that has to go. Obey the 7-minute rule. I've talked to you about the 3-minute rule, and here's the 7-minute rule. It was a rule suggested to me by a college junior who I interviewed, and the rule says that it takes at least, and this is her saying it, but it's really true, 7 minutes to see how a conversation is going to unfold in order to see how it's going to unfold. In other words, you have to stick at a conversation 7 minutes in order to see if it's going to be interesting to you. It's not like, even probably took a little while for you to see how this was going to go. And I was like prepared and like tried to have a good start and tell you what it was going to be about. I mean, it takes a little time for human beings to kind of get used to each other, even in space. You have to let things unfold and not go to your phone before those minutes are up. And this woman who told me the 7-minute rule said to me, you know, I don't give it 7 minutes most often. Most often I just go to my phone if there's a lull. So if there's a lull in the conversation, let it be. Conversation, like life, has silences, it has boring bits, and it's often in the moments when we stumble and we hesitate and we fall silent and we're not so perfect that we reveal ourselves to each other. Digital communication has gotten us accustomed to the edited life. We've got to reconsider that the unedited life is also worth living. Stay proactive. Every technology challenges our human values, which is a good thing because it causes us to reflect on what those values are. I'm so fortunate. I spend the summers at a cottage on Cape Cod, and for decades I've walked the same dunes that Thoreau once walked. And not so long ago, people used to walk them with their heads up, looking at the water and the sky and the sand and each other. And now they often walk with their heads down, typing. And even when they're with friends or partners or children, everyone is on their own devices. So to get back to the virtuous circle, you have to start somewhere. So look up, look at each other, and let's start the conversation. It is not an easy fix, but it's a beginning. And as I said, we have everything we need to begin. We have each other. Thank you very much.